Yeah. But we're getting there. So as people are joining, welcome. We are very pleased to, and I'm getting messages, is there a problem here? No. Um, the We are very pleased to have Sarah Jackson joining us today for the fourth installment of our Anti-Racism and the Disciplines series offered through the School of Liberal Arts Dean Speaker Series. As with the previous events, we're recording this one. So if you're joining us as we speak, if they go up on our website and you can listen and watch the previous events that we've had on economics, on anthropology with Lee Baker, sociology with Mary Patillo, and of course, Gary Hoover on economics. And now Sarah Jackson is taking on the field of communication studies. Communication studies, and we're thrilled to have her. Let me introduce her to you, and then also I'd like to introduce our moderator. We've developed, as this series has gone on, a pattern that we're enjoying of bringing together our faculty with our speakers to have a conversation, and I'm thrilled that Thorn Chen is going to be our faculty moderator today too. Let me say again that the series, just one word, I mean, you've seen it described on our website, of course, and I please do put you there. Joe will put it in the chat so you can link back to it. Really was born out of an interest to think about the disciplines themselves, and in complicated disciplines like communication studies make an even more complicated task, but really to think both about the disciplines themselves as organizers of knowledge production, or as disciplining in certain ways that are both enabling of academic scholarly research and work, but also limiting in some ways because of their own histories, or to think the way critical humanists and social scientists do about the ways in which the rules that we inherit as members, as scholars and students of disciplines haunt us or can be worked through. So with that, that was the kind of overarching idea of the series. And then in order to think through it with people who have been for many years in their own careers thinking through those disciplines, we've been really thrilled to bring such great scholars here, such as Sarah Jackson. Sarah, we're thrilled to have you. She is a presidential associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and very equally exciting, and what drew our attention, of course, to your work, a co-director of the Media, Inequality, and Change Center. I hope we get to hear about what's going on at the center in your work there. A scholar of the public sphere, she studies how media, journalism, and technology are used by and represent Black and feminist publics. She is the author of 2 books, Black Celebrity, Racial Politics and the Press, which was published by Routledge in 2014, and #Activism, Networks of Race and Gender Justice, published by MIT in 2020, recently. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Communication, the flagship journal in the field, the International Journal of Press Politics, and Feminist Media Studies, among many others. She serves as an associate editor at Communication Theory, the journal, and as the conversation and commentary editor at Women's Studies in Communication, as well as on the editorial board of Political Communication. She works on the advisory board of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies and the Social Science SSRC's Media Well Initiative, and is a 2020 Andrew Carnegie Fellow, working now on a book about the cultural power of African-American media makers. Sarah, I imagine that people are just thrilled to hear your work, but also saying, and it's kind of annoying how timely your work is in moments in which we're surrounded by media. So we're thrilled to have you. Let me quickly introduce Thorn. Thorn Chen, who will be moderating the discussion with you after your opening remarks, is an assistant professor in communication studies and Asian studies here at Tulane in the School of Liberal Arts. He received his PhD in cultural studies and comparative literature from the University of Minnesota. And his research examines, and Sarah, I'm saying this to the audience, but also to you, because I hope you'll get to know his amazing work that he's working on that we're so excited about, examines the transnational links between cinema, institutional power, and colonial modernity in East Asia. And his own work has appeared in Widescreen and the Journal of Chinese Cinemas. The book that I'm plugging as he writes it, Thorn, is Governing the Audiovisual Cinema and Education Republic in China, which explores how education served as an organizing rationality of institutional film use in China during the early 20th century, when elites were trying to shape how political subjects in domestic turmoil and global global inter-imperial competition. So he's doing a fabulous work, and we're thrilled to have him on our faculty. And thank you, Thorn, for moderating today. Okay, with that long introduction, I'm sorry for that. I'm going to turn over to Sarah. Again, Sarah, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And the virtual floor, I don't know what the right firm, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to start my screen share, and if one of you could give me a thumbs up to let me know that it's up, that would be great. Can you see it okay? Okay, yes, I got a thumbs up. Great. Well, first, thank you, Dean Edwards. I'm Professor Thorn Chen and the students, faculty, staff, and other community members in attendance today and who will watch this online later. I really am honored to be invited, and this is an especially busy time of year, this kind of end of semester moment. And of course, this past year has been unusually hectic and heavy and all kinds of things. So I appreciate everyone's time and attention. As I told the Dean, New Orleans is one of my favorite cities, so I really hope to visit Tulane in person in the future at some point. But for now, you know, this is the digital situation, so we're gonna make the most of it. And I will ask in advance for forgiveness if I have any tech difficulties. I think even after doing probably at this point dozens of virtual talks this past year, it still happens every now and then. So just bear with me, and thanks again for having me. All right, so to get started, I wanted to just offer a little bit of an agenda here. I will be doing a land and history acknowledgement and a call to action first, and then I'll talk a bit about the term anti-racism itself and how I understand it as a call to action, of a form of communicative practice that calls it to action. Then I'm going to talk about what communication studies is. I'm not sure who all is in the audience tonight, and what I find in a field like communication, which is a very interdisciplinary, very segmented field, that it's often useful to say, what is communication? Because people often have that question. And then after that, I'm going to talk about counter-public communication, which is what I study. And I will talk a bit about theory, and hopefully I will be able to keep you on board through the theoretical parts to sort of get to the parts that are connected to my work. And then I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A afterwards. Again, thank you all for being here. So before we get started, I want to acknowledge that though we are not gathering in the same space, histories of settler colonialism and white supremacy mark the lands on which we all live and work. I currently join you from the homelands of the Mashpee Wampanoag, Aquinnah Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts nations, and my university, and where I reside in non-COVID times, are on the colonized homelands of the Lanai Lenape people. These peoples are resilient and remain. I did a small amount of research about New Orleans, and so forgive me if this is a little rough, but from what I gathered, the region that we now call New Orleans was once called Bulbancha, a Choctaw term meaning place of many tongues. That place was originally inhabited by the Chitimacha Nation and served as a port and trading hub for more than 40 peoples, including the Atakapa, Caddo, Choctaw, Huma, Natchez, and Tunica nations. I also learned in preparation for today that Tulane University itself would not exist without the fortunes made by Paul Tulane and Randall Lee Gibson, who were the beneficiaries of the ownership of Black people and their slave labor in what are now Haiti and the United States. Similarly, the first provost of my institution, the University of Pennsylvania, owned enslaved Black people, and like many American universities, our original trustees were a who's who of slave-owning families. So in addition to thinking through these histories and what it means to our present circumstances, I'd encourage those in attendance to make a donation of money, time, or other resources to an Indigenous or Black-led organization of your choice as a meaningful contribution to supporting Indigenous and Black people across the world, and to support projects of anti-racism and decolonization. I'd also ask that you follow the leads of Indigenous and Black-led organizations and organizers, including the students on your campus, as they offer solutions to repair these histories in the present. So with that, I want to talk about what I just did, right? Because this is an anti-racist event about anti-racist communication. And what I just did there is called a land and history acknowledgement, and it's one form of anti-racist communication. It's actually a very small thing to take a few minutes out of any sort of event and offer that kind of context for the land and history of the place in which we are. So I share this small acknowledgement and call to action as one of many everyday communicative practices that can reflect what we might call anti-racist ideals. Communication practices like that one, but also mass media, everyday talk, etc., can help to raise consciousness and promulgate and solidify social change and efforts towards racial justice, a deeply important role of communication that I focus on in my own work. So communication practices are about power to me, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But communication practices based in racial justice importantly often interweave the marginalized histories and experiences of Black, Indigenous, and other racialized and other groups with contemporary contexts and demands that seek not only to acknowledge, but to repair harm. So importantly, these communication practices have to require of us concrete and collective action in order to make the change we seek as real. Otherwise, something like a land acknowledgement, for example, is just theater if we don't act on it, right? So I find that the communicative use of terms like anti-racism and anti-racist and racial justice have become symbolic in many non-activist spaces. Anti-racism, obviously, over the past year has become something of a buzzword in public consciousness, but the media has picked it up and people from all kinds of political backgrounds have picked it up. And it has been interpreted by some as being about individual behaviors and beliefs, about self-improvement. And this is something I'm very concerned about because this is a mistake and a misinterpretation of the word, a word that comes out of an activist lineage and history and insists on and requires of us community building for the sake of institutional change and systemic repair. So I wanted to offer, as I was putting these slides together, I have the Daily Show on at the same time, which is something I do often, too much media for a media person. And Tarana Burke was on the Daily Show. Tarana Burke, if you don't know, is the originator of Me Too. And she was talking to Trevor Noah about anti-racism as I was actually preparing for this today. And so I pulled this off the Daily Show's Instagram because I thought it was so great, because she talked about this same concern that, of course, anti-racism work is important, but that it's often reduced to a checklist of personal actions as opposed to collective actions, as opposed to engaging with people and really building towards something that is collective and systemic in its impulse. So the concept of anti-racism is, of course, a powerful idea. And I particularly think of the way that Angela Davis, who was one of the first people I was exposed to, used the term in her work. But when activists and organizers use it, it's always in the context of collective action, of systemic change, and of activism. And so I mentioned this as a sort of segue to thinking about the power of communication, because in the communication field, we often talk about how communication is power, communication is politics, communication is knowledge. There is a lot of theorizing from our fields that talks about the way in which we build and make society, groups, community, rules, norms, ideologies, all the things that surround us every day and create our realities through communication. And thus that is, one of the most important things about communication. But what we also know is that white supremacy has this pernicious ability to make literally anything, from a land acknowledgement, like what I offered a few minutes ago, to a term like anti-racist or a term like racial justice, into sort of meaningless, feel-good, appropriated mush, right? That becomes sort of something that you can buy on Instagram through a promoted ad, right? So we have to be diligent about not letting the term become a disguise for non-action, and instead be clear that it is in fact a term that requires action in a collective space. So I say all that because I'm thinking deeply. I think we all are over the past year, but I'm thinking especially deeply about the ways that universities are implicated in white supremacy and racism, and universities themselves, and in some cases our fields, hence, the theme of this series, have absolutely been complicit in white supremacist practices, but now, as it has become popular, have taken up the language of anti-racism and being against white supremacy, while still in many ways reproducing those same things. And so this is just something on my mind. If there's time later, Professor Chen can ask me about why it's so strongly on my mind, and I can share. But yeah, there's a lot for us to, I think, unpack there. So I'm going to move on from this and talk a bit about then what communication studies is anyway. I appreciate that some folks in the audience, I'm sure, are like me, communication faculty, and are very familiar, but I always find it useful because if you are communication faculty, when people say, oh, what do you teach, or what are you professor of? And you say communication, people go, huh. And, depending on what they think communication is, they might guess at what that means. So I've already talked a little bit about communication, but I really wanted to talk about the field of communication studies a little bit, just where it's rooted and where the possibilities lie for justice-centered, or if you prefer, anti-racist work within communication studies. So compared to some fields, communication is something of a newer academic field. As Sylvia Wasteboard has noted, it's fragmented and hyper-specialized, which means that depending on where or how scholars are trained in communication, it might carry very different meanings, approaches, and expectations. So it could be that the study of communication looks like the study of Frederick Douglass's famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," a speech that might interest a rhetorician because of the way that it uses pathos and ethos, and the way that it becomes persuasive towards the cause of abolition. The study of communication might also be the study of media, from newspapers to film, to understanding, how these media inform the public and what values, norms, and ideologies they carry with them. It might also be the study of a Girl Scout troop, to learn how group communication can build self-esteem and leadership. And of course, it might also be the study of social networks or social media, and thinking through how technology is used to build identities. And these are only a few examples that I had space for on this slide, but I haven't mentioned political campaigns. I haven't mentioned the psychological effects of media. So there are very, very, very many sort of entry points to the study of communication. What all these entry points have in common is that they examine or understand the power of communication to shape our lives, our society, our politics, our culture. And so, like most academic fields, communication has a problem with exclusion. Communication has a problem with whiteness. The canon of the field is understood to be made up, like many other fields, of white men. So rhetoricians might look to Socrates and Plato. People studying public opinion might look to John Dewey and Walter Lippmann. And I hope Professor Chen will ask me about some of the recent sort of debates and controversies around the whiteness of the field of communication. Of course, there's even a hashtag, which, I like hashtags. So communication so white, to sort of talk more about some of those sort of debates. But for now, I want to say that I personally, and in my own work, I think of communication studies as a field that has deep and fertile ground for interventions about race and racism. And so I am going to move to the next slide and say a little bit more about that. Before I move to the next slide, I just want to give a trigger warning that there is an image of police murder in the next slide. And so be aware that that's coming if you need to. Okay, so what does the just study of communication look like? Here we have a very small segment of the official statement that was given out by the Minneapolis police after the murder of George Floyd, in which they used a lot of passive voice, if you have read the whole statement, to describe what they categorized as a medical incident, as the police were on site when a medical incident happened and this person died of a medical emergency. Of course, we know it was basically a fiction. It was a lie. There was a murder. We all watched it brutally occur. And so, you know, at its core, sort of just approach communication app doesn't just ask what communication is for in this situation, right? It asks, who does communication serve? Whose communication do we hear and honor? And how does communication reinforce or challenge social power? And these questions, what people in organizing or activist spaces might call a power analysis of communication, can help us explain this example, this recent example from Minneapolis, about why there's one version of the story coming from the police that is not at all reflective of reality, because there's something happening here about, right, very clearly the service of particular interests, people, and sets of ideologies about the value of Black life and about who deserves to be protected in communicative acts, right? But I also, as an example here, often think of that very famous, and I thought of this, of course, because I wish I was in New Orleans with you all, you know, the very famous side-by-side captions after Hurricane Katrina. One was an image of a Black child carrying food, and the caption writer for the AP had described that child as looting a grocery store. And the other was image of two white adults carrying food through the floodwaters, and they were described in their caption as finding food. And this is an example that I use in my classes when I teach all the time, because this is clearly a question where sort of a just communication framework, a critical communication framework, would allow us to ask a lot of questions here about race, about power, about inequity, and about why the default is to describe one of these people one way and the other people the other way, and what it means to how we understand disaster, poverty, and race in America. So with that, let me share what that looks like in my own work. I do want to say that when the dean invited me for the speaker series, there are so many folks I admire in the field of communication studies doing really great interventionist work that focuses on issues of racial justice or focuses on anti-racist issues, is critical in its approach. And I actually said, like, why don't you invite this person? Why don't you invite that person? So of course, my approach to doing this is only one person's approach. It's only one way to sort of think about just communication frameworks. But I do want to share that with you today. And I'm going to start by talking about the public sphere. So please bear with me through a little bit of public sphere theory. Okay, so how does democracy work? How does civil society work? Well, Habermas, he's one of those guys who's in the canon of the field of communication, and he's from the later era of the Frankfurt School in communication studies, which if you're a comm person, you know, is part of our canon. Habermas was worried about democracy, right? He was writing at a period in the 20th century when mass media was popular, societies were more diverse than ever. And he said, look, in an ideal and democratic public sphere, in an ideal civil society, there's open and engaged debate and communication. And that debate and communication sort of transforms and expands and makes societies more democratic and better. And Habermas sort of infamously used the examples of French salons and cafes after the French Revolution, and the ways in which citizens who were not part of the monarchy were able to come together and debate and remake French society the ways that they thought that it should be, right? He also talks a lot about the European Enlightenment and sort of other periods in which various folks were empowered to debate the ideals of their society and come up with sort of new forms of government, new forms of democracy, new values and new norms. Of course, one of the more famous examples of this that has only become more famous thanks to the Broadway musical, right, is the Federalist Papers and the work of, in this country, some of the founders around writing the Federalist Papers and the Constitution, right? The idea in these cases is that these forms of communication and these forms of public debate would further the democratic society and would make for a healthier civil society and a healthier public sphere and public politics. And so one of the important things that Habermas said specifically was that because of the size of contemporary civil society and the modern public sphere, that it was media and sort of other forms of mass communication that often constructed, maintained, and moved us towards or away from greater democracy, right? And so, for example, here, as I've put up, television as a phenomena, early phenomena, right? But ultimately, what public sphere theory suggests is that communication is political, public communication in particular is political because it can inform or misinform, expand, limit, bolster or undermine the way citizens in a given society or community understand their roles and understand their responsibilities to each other, and in turn influences the way that they engage in politics. And this framework of what a healthy democratic public sphere looks like has informed a lot of the field of communication, especially the areas of political communication, especially the area of rhetoric and several other areas. But the problem, and you may have already guessed what the problem with this theory and what this framework is that the public sphere developed with exclusion at its core. The examples that Habermas idealized in his model were only possible because chattel slavery and settler colonialism allowed European and American elites the time and resources and leisure to consider democratic ideals. Thus, institutions and communication of the public sphere, including those which we most glorify, were not ever open to everyone, but only existed because of the violent exclusion of particular groups. And so this idea that there was some kind of ideal public sphere at any point in time is simply a myth, because of course we know that various groups have been excluded, right? Women were excluded from citizenship. People of color were excluded from citizenship, non-landowners were excluded from citizenship, and none of these folks had the opportunity to develop and contribute to our democratic public sphere. But what about these excluded groups, right? And this is where counter public sphere theory comes in, and this is really where I root my work and why I titled the slide, Why Counter Public Communication Matters. So are these excluded groups who aren't included silent or absent because of their exclusion? Well, the answer is no, of course not. Counter public sphere scholarship tells us that groups at the margins, groups who have been excluded, even in the most sort of violent and obscene ways, have developed their own spaces and institutions for democratic engagement. They've developed their own forms of communication, their own ways of passing knowledge. And so you can even think of something like the antebellum era in the US South, when it was illegal for Black people, enslaved Black people, to learn to read and write, but knowledge was still passed through oral traditions, through songs, through dance, and various other ways. And these were all built in and through a community of communication that was also resisting the domination of white supremacy. And so we know that these groups on the margins have developed these spaces and developed their own sort of politics, culture, and communication. And what is crucial to understanding and thinking about the public sphere is that these forms of knowledge and communication don't exist, you know, simply at the margins, but in fact make as their goal intervention into the dominant public sphere, right? There was always the intent from those on the outside, those excluded in this sort of, you know, ideal model of the public sphere, that there could one day be a broader democracy. There could one day be a civil society that was inclusive, that did look like an ideal in which everyone has a voice. And so in the case of Black Americans, which much of my work is on, the examples are endless, right? The examples have centered Black knowledge and communication, and in doing so, you know, have faced down a lot of violence and resistance, but have also pushed forward American democracy. And so I put on this slide just a very few examples of this. Freedom's Journal, you know, is one of my favorite examples. Freedom's Journal was the first African-American run newspaper, and it was founded and first printed in 1827. So yes, if you do the math, that's quite a while before slavery was abolished. And in fact, the editors, John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish, in the first edition of Freedom's Journal said that they started the newspaper to address the issues which concern us dearly, which were being misrepresented by, you know, what was white newspapers, right, that never included or thought about including the vantage points and knowledge and frameworks of Black Americans. They weren't even considered Americans, so why would they be included, right? And we can do this through sort of any period of time. Of course, Ida B. Wells famously recorded and reported on lynching and lynching throughout the United States of America, and did so at great risk to herself when many American mainstream, which mainstream of course means white in a segregated press, newspapers were justifying or minimizing or legitimizing lynching. You know, Ida B. Wells's dogged reporting really changed the way and continues to change the way we understand racialized violence in the United States and what's at stake. We obviously have seen this through many periods. I put Fannie Lou Hamer up here, who, you know, famously testified at the Democratic National Convention in 1964 about voter suppression in the South, and you know, was considered sort of such a threat to the mainstream Democratic National Party that Lyndon Johnson actually called a press conference to interrupt her testimony at the DNC, just to sort of try to keep what she was saying at the margins, which in part was the fact that it wasn't just one party that was really engaging in violent forms of voter suppression in the American South. And, you know, more contemporarily, you know, we have all kinds of examples from Black podcasts to, you know, most recently, something like the New York Times' 1619 Project, which shows sort of both the remarkable progress we've made and also how things aren't that different. And I say that to say that, of course, getting to publish this in the New York Times Magazine for the number of sort of Black voices and Black experts and Black history and Black knowledge to be featured in a mainstream publication does show, you know, that things aren't segregated in the same way that they used to be. But some of the intense backlash, I mean, you think about the Trump administration actually putting together a committee to respond and undermine the 1619 Project, sort of because it challenges the idea that the founders were these, you know, pure people who did no wrong, among other things, right? And locate slavery as part of sort of the founding story of our nation, really shows that counter public communication and counter public narratives continue to be controversial in the mainstream public sphere and continue to face pretty serious backlash. So this idea of what counterpublics say and do and why it matters and how it changes our politics is really at the core of my own work. And so I'm going to talk a little bit, and I will just stay brief on some of the projects that I have worked on and I'm working on, because I do want to make sure that we have time for as much discussion as we need. But in my work, I've attempted to make interventions at several points around the question of communication, publics, and power. and particularly on issues of racial justice and gender justice. And so, you know, I wrote a book about Black celebrity activism, which I didn't realize was going to be as timely as it was. It actually came out, I think if I remember, it came out maybe I don't know, like 4 or 5 months before Colin Kaepernick first took a knee. I'm not sure if I'm getting the timeline right there. But I said he's not in the book because of the timing, but it suddenly became very, very hot topic. You know, where I talked about the fact that because of the segregation that has existed and continues to exist in American society, that Black celebrities often are brokers between Black political thought and Black counterpublics and the mainstream spaces and sort of mainstream media and mainstream narratives that are part of our everyday politics. And a story that I have to tell about actually what inspired my work on celebrity and on celebrity activism is that it's another Katrina example. Katrina happened when I was in my PhD program. And I actually was part of a research group that did a study on news discourse around Hurricane Katrina and how Katrina was being covered. And one of the things we found that was very interesting, and I don't know how many people still remember this because it's been a long time, and also because Kanye West has kind of changed personalities, but there was this moment during a fundraiser where Kanye West broke script, where they were raising money. And at that point, you had heard Black activists and Black religious leaders and Black community members in New Orleans say, this is clearly about race. Look at how our communities are being treated versus how other communities are treated. Why are we being referred to as refugees? Why aren't we getting this kind of aid? Why are we being herded like animals, you know, et cetera? But the mainstream news was still very much using the catastrophe frame, this is, you know, a natural disaster frame, and they weren't really talking about race yet. Kanye West broke script and said, famously, George Bush doesn't care about Black people, but that wasn't the only thing he said. He also talked about how so much money was going to the Iraq War instead of being used to help poor citizens, poor Black citizens in the United States. And he also talked about the way that New Orleans police and National Guard had been given a free-for-all to shoot quote unquote looters who were often, of course, Black people just trying to survive, right, this disaster. And what we found in that study was that the mainstream discourse, the mainstream news, you know, NBC, CBS, CNN, they shifted the way that they were talking about what was happening in New Orleans and around Katrina, because suddenly there was a celebrity who said it was racist. And so they used this sort of celebrity pop culture angle to start talking about, well, is it racist? Is the lack of response because so many New Orleans citizens are Black? And so that was actually what inspired my early work on Black celebrity. And I sort of say, like, you know, Kanye West, well, it's a whole thing to unpack. Not the same guy anymore, but it was a really interesting moment. So since then, for the past few years, I've worked pretty deeply on digital interventions. Particularly, we're looking at Twitter and looking at the way that discourses, counterpublic discourses on Twitter evolve, spread, and sort of shift our public conversations and public narratives. And this actually came out of a moment that is before anyone heard of the hashtag Black Lives Matter. I want to think, I'm going to get my years wrong because at this point, it's been enough years and I'm old enough that I'm like, what year was that? But I want to say it was maybe 2013. That the New York City Police Department decided to have a public relations campaign with the hashtag MyNYPD, where they asked people, hey, do you have photos with you and, you know, your friendly New York City police? They even gave a sample of a tourist standing in Times Square with 2 police on horsebacks. And they said, hey, tag us, tweet us, and we'll share your tweet to like all of our social media. We can guess now, I'm sure people who are here can guess now what happened, but it was early enough in the Twitter days that establishments and you know, political and sort of other sort of state organizations hadn't really figured out how Twitter worked. And the hashtag was hijacked and overwhelmed by images of police brutality. And it was ordinary people. It was ordinary New Yorkers. It wasn't celebrities. It wasn't journalists. It was just regular folks saying, sure, you want me to share a photo? Here's the hashtag with, this photo and this photo and that photo. And some of them were recent photos, and some of them were from what had been recent Occupy Wall Street protests. Some of them were historical from cases like the shooting of Amadou Diallo. And they overtook the narrative on Twitter, and the story became about the NYPD and police brutality. And the thing that was really interesting to me in that moment was that not only did it overtake the hashtag and trend because of the conversation about police brutality, but mainstream news organizations then picked up the story because it was trending on Twitter that there was this backlash against the My NYPD happening. And so I thought, well, wow, this is really, really interesting. And I have to study this because this is an interesting and really great example of a counter-public intervention, right? The state very clearly told us through their first tweet how they wanted us to imagine and think about the role of police and policing. And the people, regular people, responded, actually, no, this is how we understand policing. And it's something very different than what you're telling us, right? And so over a series of years, I worked with my former colleague, Brooke Foucault-Wells, who's a network scientist, and my former colleague, Moya Bailey, who's a digital humanist. And we did work on a lot of different hashtags, feminist hashtags, racial justice hashtags. Those often, of course, overlap, really to look at the ways that our public culture and politics were being influenced by the fact that very sort of non-intentionally, a space like Twitter was sort of overrepresented by or overused by Black Americans. And so, many of its early users were Black Americans, were people from the feminist blogosphere, and they were really able to get a hold there and shift the kind of discourse that was happening. And so, of course, our book hashtag Activism, which just came out last year, is the more recent iteration of all of that work. And we look at many hashtags and sort of think about how those hashtags have changed us, but really how those hashtags worked and developed over time. And I think the most famous examples of these, of course, are the hashtag Black Lives Matter and the hashtag Me Too. But one of the things that we find in the book, of course, is that way before we had seen the hashtag Black Lives Matter, we had seen the hashtag Me Too, that counterpublics on Twitter were using hashtags and other forms of narrative communication to tweet about these same issues and really developing a set of identity, claims, and politics through their discourse online. One of the other areas that I study is sort of the intervention of storytelling and public discourse. And so my latest project, which I'm working on with a grant from the Carnegie Foundation, is specifically on the cultural power of Black media makers and how Black media makers and the stories they tell intervene in the whiteness of media and the stories that become popular and everyday in our society, and in turn then affect our understandings of ourselves, our democracy, and our politics. And so I just threw up here, I recently hosted an event called Black Media Makers and the Fierce Urgency of Now through the center that I'm a co-director of, the Media Inequality and Change Center, where we invited a whole bunch of great media makers, and they're kind of cut off in this photo, but I wanted to put them up anyways. In this case, this panel was, you obviously see me up there, but Jean Demby, who's the co-host of Code Switch on NPR, Maori Holmes, who's the founder of the Black Star Film Festival, and Erin Haynes down there under me, who's the founder of The 19th, which is sort of a feminist and women's focused news organization. Before that, Erin was for a long time a journalist at sort of mainstream newspapers. And so one of the things I'm doing now then is thinking a lot about the power of stories and the power of specifically Black stories and the work that Black media makers do and how those stories have really changed us, changed our nation. We can go back to that first Black newspaper, Freedom's Journal, or we can go back to Ida B. Wells, and we can see now in retrospect that these things had huge significance on the development of progressive ends in our country. And so part of what I'm trying to trace in the new project is this contemporary moment. What are the stories that are being told in this contemporary moment that are really shifting the ways that we're having conversations? I would argue, for example, that one recent example is Ta-Nehisi Coates's work on reparations, which has really popularized, right? I mean, it's not as if the conversation about reparations is new if you're in certain circles, but popularized it for new audiences in ways that have become really important in this contemporary moment. So I've also done some collaboration and community work sort of in all these projects. And hopefully we can talk more about that in the Q&A, because I've worked on some things with activists, as well as part of my effort to sort of trace how counterpublic interventions happen. So with that, I think I will stop there. I probably tried to cover maybe too many things at once, hopefully not. But thanks for having me. I really look forward to chatting with Professor Chen and seeing what the audience questions look like. And yeah, I think we will stop there. And I'll stop share here. Okay.
Thanks so much, Professor Jackson, for these really thought-provoking opening remarks. And also, if I may, let me thank Dean Edwards for the really generous introduction at the beginning of this event. So Professor Jackson, I really appreciated what you said at the beginning about land acknowledgements, right? And the one that you also invoked. And I had also prepared my own, but I think that, the one that you did matched exactly what I was going to say, and I think I like the way that you kind of connected these particular types of gestures to invocations of a just communication or a just community, and that these are things that are calls to action rather than being kind of performative acts. And it really made me think of a concept by a communication scholar, when John Durham Peters distinguishes between communication as the sending of messages and communication as communion or community. And it seems that in a lot of the framing that you give about a just communication is that you're kind of thinking through the ways in which we, who are we in community with when we communicate, and who are we accountable to? And those people are not necessarily, they can be, but they're not necessarily the people that we're directly talking to, over any individual channel. So I think, this brings me into just, thinking about just how meta, I guess, some of these concepts, as well as the methods that we use when we study media and communication can be, and so I guess my first question for you is really about, I guess, the concept that you just introduced, which is that of the counterpublic, and to work through that. So in the first two books, I mean, in your two books, the counterpublic is a very, very central concept there. And in both, you're working through both the kind of enabling function of counterpublic spheres, as well as the limits that are imposed by power structures and power relationships on how in particular how marginalized, and in your first book particularly Black American subjects can become visible, and to become visible in relation to each other as well as in relation to a broader public. So I'm wondering if in what I noticed is that in your book on Black celebrity and political dissent, that it seems that in that book that the limits of the public sphere and the limits of, in particular, mainstream media are very, very poignant. And that, visibility is compromised visibility. Whereas in the book on hashtag activism, there's somewhat of a different tone in terms of the optimism for social media as a platform that enables people to create counter narratives for themselves rather than waiting for the media to kind of frame them. So I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about kind of the movement and the kind of differentiation between the kind of contexts that structure the public sphere and structure counterpublics across these two books.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I'm just taking notes because that's a very, I love this question. Yes. Okay. So absolutely. I think there's a few things that I will say about this, which is you're right that the Black Celebrity book is much more cautious about what the potentials of counterpublic intervention are in what we would call legacy media. And in part, that has a large part to do with the fact that many of the cases that I look at in that book are historical. There's a case from the 1940s, there's several cases from the 1960s, there's several cases from the 1990s. And part of that, of course, is that historically the public sphere was more segregated. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to suggest that the public sphere is not extremely and painfully segregated now. It is, but it simply is a little bit less painfully segregated now. I'll give you an example, which is, of course, the case of Paul Robeson, who, when, Paul Robeson became an outspoken activist and really was talking openly and explicitly after being wildly popular with white audiences, by the way, was talking openly and explicitly, not just about racial inequality and racial justice, but about class, about capitalism as a problem. He, of course, became a persona non grata, not just to white fans, but to the US government, who blacklisted him and took away his means of earning money and took away his means of leaving. They took his passport. And on top of that, there's a case that I describe in the book in which there were attempts to lynch him, and not like symbolic attempts, but actual, lynch mobs showing up at places where Paul Robeson was going to give a speech because he was being so villainized and cast as so un-American during this, during McCarthyism, during this moment of sort of extreme polarization. And so, that's one of the older examples in the book, but I talk about how part of the limits of these folks being the only person to sort of be able to intervene into the whiteness and the white supremacy of legacy media is that their access to those spaces could also be taken away, right? When Eartha Kitt in 1968 challenges the Vietnam War while visiting the White House, she too becomes persona non grata and she loses roles. She loses career opportunities. And so these legacy media have sort of this way in which they very clearly control, punish, and manage the introduction of counter-public politics and thought. And part of that is done successfully because these folks are, essentially by themselves in these spaces, right? They don't have the power of numbers, but also they're very vulnerable. And I don't want to say that that is not still the case today, because it absolutely is. And we saw this happen with Colin Kaepernick, right? We saw, Colin Kaepernick became not just the NFL, but much of the media's sacrificial lamb to suddenly, protesting white supremacy was unpatriotic. Well, that sounds really scarily familiar to what they said about Paul Robeson and what they said about Mahmoud Abdul-Jabbar and what they, right? All these people, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, and all these other folks whose protests have been then cast as unpatriotic, right? And so, of course, in these contexts, there are limits, which is that as long as legacy media are functioning through the logics of white supremacy and the norms of white supremacy, they're managing and controlling Black dissent. And in doing so, they're managing and controlling how much counter-public knowledge is accessible. I want to say that I think this is still true today in legacy media. I mean, across, it could film, journalism, whatever, we still see, oh, here's some entry points, and the entry points are bigger and greater, and there's more, right? There's more power in numbers. There's more Black media makers and folks sort of making it into these spaces, but there still very much is some backlash, right? Nicole Hannah-Jones received a lot of backlash for the 1619 Project, even as it was simultaneously celebrated. But I think the tone difference that you're catching between, the first book and the second book is, I want to be careful about this, because I'm not a digital optimist. I'm not a person who thinks that by any means, and we say this in the book, the internet is not democratic. It's not made to be liberatory. It is actually a military technology. Its primary use is surveillance, right? And we have seen very much over the past 4 years that the internet and technology can be very much used for anti-democratic and fascist means, right? So there's nothing about the technology that makes me more optimistic, except, right, that instead of it being mediated one-way communication like you would see in legacy media, that new media, and not all, but some new media platforms, because they're direct, right, because there isn't a journalist framing the story, or because there isn't somebody intervening, a PR person or this or this or this, you can see and hear the narratives firsthand. And so you and I had talked about, I think over email, a great example of this is the so-called Arab Spring. When the Arab Spring happened, there were these technological determinists who were way overly optimistic, who were like, the Facebook revolution, this happened because of Facebook, which, by the way, is not true. If you know anything about Egyptian politics, you know that this revolution was boiling at the surface, that these activists had been working for a long time. But Facebook was used as a tool. It was used as one of many communicative tools to promulgate activist messages, to create solidarity, to sort of spread awareness about issues. And importantly, in the new media, you could hear directly from the activists themselves, right? It wasn't a journalist interviewing them and then reframing it. It wasn't the state telling you that they were terrorists, right? You could actually log on to Twitter, for example, and you could watch these kids in Tahrir Square lay themselves down in front of tanks on their live stream, right? And so you knew the direct communication that was happening. And so I think part of, if anything, the more optimistic tone is that you can hear directly from the counterpublics in these spaces, right? Without sort of the intervention, without the mediation. Also, there are unique places where this works and where this doesn't work. This hasn't worked well for American racial justice organizing on Facebook because of the platform's architectures and structures. But on Twitter, where Black users make up a disproportionate number of users, they actually outnumber percentage-wise, themselves compared to our numbers in the population, and where just the functionality by accident, really, of the way that trending works is that it's easier for ordinary people to go viral, right? And so it's easier to hear from and see what folks are saying without that mediation. Now, I want to say a couple things about that. Twitter has changed since we started writing the book, and since many of the cases in the book. And as Twitter increasingly became a professionalized space where journalists and politicians and representatives of the state use it, it has become less so easy for ordinary people to go viral and for ordinary narratives to spread. Although I think that it's certainly still more so than through mainstream news channels, right? It's certainly still more than that. But also we've of course seen an intense backlash. We've seen that these same folks are the subjects of intense trolling, hate speech, all kinds of hate campaigns. And that of course we know the far right has also used these same spaces to organize and to spread narratives because of the fact that virality sort of benefits these sort of like grassroots ways of spreading it and thinking through knowledge. So I want to be cautious to say, I think the shift is not so much that any platform or technology is made for counterpublics. And in fact, that's what I actually think is really compelling about counterpublics, right? Is that all these platforms, technology spaces aren't made for them. In fact, they're made to exclude them. And what I think the story is not so much about the technologies, but about the innovation of people who then figure out how to use these technologies. They figure out shorthands like hashtags, or, they figure out hacks, or they figure out whatever to get the counterpublic narrative into the center. And of course, it's much, much harder to silence 1 million plus 10 million, 30 million Black Lives Matter tweets than it is to silence one person, like is often the case in, sort of those examples I wrote about in my first book in legacy media. So I would say that's sort of the difference that I see there.
Thank you. That's, one thing that you said that really got me thinking was, about these recent changes in Twitter as the platform has become more mainstream and so-called respectable, right? And that it gets taken into mainstream journalism and becomes a form of sourcing for journalism. So I guess this leads into a second question that I think also struck me when reading your #Activism book, which is the question of what happens when something goes mainstream, right? And you articulate this when you're talking about how, for example, the yes all women, yes all white women hashtag, and also in terms of how Say Her Name was originally about recognizing Black women and trans people killed in police violence and extrajudicial violence, and then it became kind of generalized. And so the question here is, because of these viral publics, there's a process of mainstreaming, but there's also, it seems like there's a process also of forgetting, right? Of forgetting the origins, and that so much of this is generated by Black women, and that doesn't get recognized. So I'm wondering, how you're thinking about kind of the ethical practice of doing that recognition, and and how that works in your analysis of hashtags.
Yeah, great question again. So 2 things I'll say about this is, I think I said this maybe on like the the second slide or something, but one of the things white supremacy is the best at is appropriation, right? Is sort of watering down, and it's not just white supremacy. It's literally, it is because it's the core factor here, but this is how, I teach social movements, and this is how establishments work, is that they say, oh, you want this thing? Like, okay, we're on the same side as you. And then they water down, right? It's sort of one of the arguably biggest failures of the civil rights era, which is that we got a lot of legislation, but not a lot of cultural change in terms of really undoing things like poverty, because what the changes that were made were moderate changes instead of the sort of radical changes that really were needed. And that's how establishments work. And so it's not surprising at all at any historical moment and through any medium when an activist narrative, I'll take the example of #MeToo. We know the lineage here is that Tarana Burke, who is a Black woman who is specifically working with Black girls in a Black community, is the person who first uses this. And then a white celebrity, Alyssa Milano, uses it as sort of like a generalized, for any woman who's ever experienced, sexual violence. And it trends, right, because of that visibility. And what I thought was really interesting is that there was a quick call in where people said, hey, Alyssa Milano, like, can you credit Toronto? And she did, to her credit. I mean, I think to her credit, has done a great job of, sort of acknowledging that. But that now we have this weird thing where like we have Oscar nominated films and part of the PR from the film studio is like, this is the Me Too film that we've been waiting for, and they're like using this hashtag that is about people revealing often violent and traumatic and personal stories of violence as sort of like a marketing ploy for, and you can guess which film I'm thinking about, which I maybe am in the minority, I did not enjoy. But so we absolutely see this, and this is standard, right? There was a big conversation about this when Colin Kaepernick signed with Nike as a Nike spokesperson, right? Can you really be a racial justice advocate and be for Nike, who uses sweatshops and like is like kind of the definition of capitalism, right? And so, I mean, one of my things about this appropriation that happens is that part of the work that activists and organizers do is knowing that the narratives that they introduce are going to be watered down. The attempts to respond to them are going to be more moderate than radical. And that's part of the game, right? I mean, that's part of the back and forth of the communication between activist narratives and mainstream narratives and counterpublic narratives and dominant narratives, is understanding that you sort of often have to re-enter. And that's actually why I started this whole conversation tonight with like, this is what anti-racism means. It requires us to act, not just like read the right books and listen to the right podcasts, right? Like it requires you to be part of a social movement that overthrows white supremacy. Like it's not a joke, right? And so that's sort of on the activists. You can't control that the mainstream is going to appropriate. You can simply sort of engage in this constant corrective. The second part of what you asked about the ethical practice of making sure that, credit is given and that we don't do that in our work. This is such an important question. And I'm really glad you asked this because unfortunately, one of the things as we were writing the #Activism book that we're very aware of, I mean, part of what allowed us to write the book as we wrote it is that both Moya and I are before writing the book, we're very active on Twitter, and we're part of the feminist Twitter sphere and the racial justice Twitter sphere, Black Twitter and et cetera. And people knew us and trusted us. But one of the things that we heard over and over again was that, academics and journalists, they come in, they screenshot tweets, they put them in their articles, they make us vulnerable to surveillance, they use our labor, right? I mean, people are engaging in a form of digital labor when they're doing, sort of racial justice education or feminist education online. And we don't get anything out of it, right? And there's cases where with like hashtags like Me Too, who had only a few followers, their accounts were screenshot and put in like the Washington Post. And now they're being inundated with rape threats, right? Because they sort of suddenly became like a public person, right? And so it really behooved us as we were writing the book, like to not be users, right? We are part of these communities. And so being part of these communities helps us understand that we shouldn't just be using what's happening here, but we should really be a part of it. And so one of the things we did in #Activism, which is we actually invited the folks who originated hashtags or who were otherwise engaged in #Activism or popular in the networks to write blurbs about how they understood the hashtags and how their experience of engaging in activism was. And here's the important part. We didn't just invite them to do it because, that's a form of labor. We paid them, right? So we applied for a grant and we got a grant and we were able to pay these folks who are every day on Twitter doing forms of digital labor for the world, unpaid, to contribute to our book. And we felt it was really important in our book to have sort of our scholarship appear alongside, their first person narratives. And that's why the preface of our book is one of those narratives, just to set the stage that, this is possible to do a sort of conscientious and collaborative work where we really acknowledge. And, as you said, in the case of many of these viral hashtags, both racial justice and gender justice hashtags, it's Black women often Black queer women who are doing the majority of this work, right? And that is really crucial. So that was sort of how we tried to address that ethical question.
Great, thanks. So this ties into one of the questions. Well, I have two questions for you. One of them is the question from Professor Vicky Mayer, which is specifically about how you use Twitter, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, what are your thoughts about as a person using the medium? And let me just ask, you know, how your identity as a Twitter user intersects with, you know, your identity as a communication scholar.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just ask that question now, and then I'll move into the question about.
No, I appreciate it, and I'll try to be brief so we have time. I was telling some folks earlier, you know, I've been doing work on Twitter for years now, but I don't consider myself an internet studies person. I consider myself a counter public sphere theorist. I consider myself a Black studies person. What I'm really interested in is studying these narratives that are interventionist narratives, right, about how we think and talk about issues of race and gender and sort of other equity and social justice issues. And I started studying Twitter because this was like a really fruitful space to do it. So I was on Twitter way before I ever thought in a million years I would be studying Twitter. You know, I was an early adopter. I joined Twitter when I was in graduate school, and I had the time to be, you know, tweeting all the time. And at the time, I also was a really active part of the feminist blogosphere. I had my own blog, and I would contribute. I was a contributor to the Huffington Post, and I don't know if they still do this, but the Huffington Post used to like never pay anyone. We were all just there for exposure. So, you know, and so I knew all these folks, and a large part of my early Twitter network came from you know, sort of the Black blogosphere and the feminist blogosphere, that when this microblogging site was introduced, all of us that were already active in these blogging spaces moved over to Twitter, like, oh, what is this thing? What is microblogging? And so in early Twitter, and it's hard to like imagine now because it's so huge now, but in early Twitter, most of the people you would talk to and go back and forth with, you sort of, maybe you'd never met in real life, but you'd seen them over on the feministing blog, or you'd seen them over in like the comments on Post Bougie, or you'd seen them over, you know, you'd seen them somewhere. And so you'd had interacted with them online. And, you know, at that time, we didn't worry about fake accounts or bots. I mean, that wasn't a thing yet, right? There was a level of sort of like trust. And that's actually part of how I built the relationships with many of the folks that we studied in the #Activism book, was that I was already sort of part of those communities. The way I've used Twitter has changed because Twitter has changed. It's become huge. It's become hyper visible. It's full of like harassment and hate speech, which I have received my share of. And so I think there was a point in my career years after, you know, where I said, okay, too time consuming, two, you know, it can be a lot. Right. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to use this mostly for broadcasting, you know, work or projects I'm working on. And I think over time I've become more laid back about that, and I share more personal things, or anyone who follows me, I don't know if Professor Mayer follows me on Twitter, but I'm snarky sometimes. I still am connected to the original core group of people, and they're still in the group of people I follow. I don't follow that many people. And so I still feel like it's the first place I turn for news. You know, for example, last week when the verdict in Minneapolis was coming out, I can't bear to watch broadcast news because they show the video, which I don't want to watch over again. It's so traumatic. They're talking about racial reconciliation and how, you know, all the stuff that I'm just like, because of what I study, I just think I can't take it. So I go to Twitter and I know who the people are who I'm going to watch their timeline and see their analysis for what's happening. And I can get it there first and know what's happening in a way that resonates with me and my needs. So that's sort of a little bit about, you know, what my relationship with Twitter has been. And it's weird now because, like, you know, my boss follows me on Twitter. I have students' parents who follow me on Twitter. And so, you know, it became clear at some point, like, I can't exactly say what I think on Twitter all the time, but I still try to be authentic as much as possible.
So I think here's a set of questions that I think are all revolving around the question of, to what ends do we do research? And this particularly responds to your framing at the beginning about what is a just communication, right? So I have a question from the audience, from Reggie Parquet, who's asking about, I guess, policy implications. So, how does white supremacy, communication, and language inform, if at all, the formulation of anti-racist policy? And I want to combine that just with, thinking about to what end is, what kinds of effectivity, what kinds of practice does research in the university get integrated with? And I know that you're also the co-director of the Center for Media Diversity and Social Change. And so here I'd like to invite you to say a bit more about, what you do there. I know that institution is very much promotes community engaged research, right? And so how do you think about community engaged research? We see one model in the #Activism book, and how it's about kind of integrating voices of people, on the ground, so to speak. But I mean, so those are the general. That's the general orbit of
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. I'm just writing down so I don't forget the two parts of the question. Yeah, to the first question about how does white supremacy and communication language inform, or I guess fail to inform, I would say, obviously, anti-racist policy. I mean, man, this is like, where do you even start? It's everywhere, right? I mean, most recently, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic about the way that cop speak or propaganda, and it's the language that it's literally built into the training of the folks that work in public relations and communications for state governments around the first responders and police, the way that it has been treated as authoritative by journalists. And so you'll often see these reports of passive voice. Man dies after shooting, police involved shooting. And, it's terrible because it strips responsibility from the state, for these acts of violence. But in terms of thinking about policy, like this is just one small area, of course, but an important one, policy around police brutality and how to intervene in police brutality, it really limits the public's imagination and, of course, politicians' imaginations and policymakers' imaginations, because we've been swimming in this sea our whole life of this language around which we are supposed to take the narrative version of what happened from the police as authoritative. And if they did something wrong, it's presented in passive voice. The victim is like dehumanized. There's all these things that then prevent us from imagining the real solutions that could get to the crux of this, right? And so, I think that is one example right there. I think the fact that it's so hard for so many policymakers and so many Americans to imagine a world without police is a communication problem in part, right? It's the fact that our imaginations have been limited by what we understand to be safety and security, and how those have been constructed through us for our whole lives through television images and, authoritative deferral and, like all kinds of things that are very much, communication is very much a part of. And so I would say that's just one example. I mean, you could get in there anywhere. Another, of course, sort of heinous example is the way that the ability to really ethically and morally address poverty in this country has been completely undercut and completely debilitated by essentially conservative propaganda about welfare that started primarily during the Reagan era, but is based largely on myths and mythologies and racist stereotypes about the poor. And that for so long and continually, those are our default ways of communicating and thinking about the problem of poverty it prevents us from imagining sort of alternatives. And so those are just two examples that I would say really we can see very clearly in our policy, but you could probably pick any policy in America and do the same sort of, deconstruction in that regard. Okay, so the second part of your question was about the Media Inequality Change Center, which I'm a co-director of, and the impetus for community engagement. And thanks for asking me this. Yeah. One of the things, we're doing at Mike is we're working with, I'll give you a couple examples of some of the work that we're doing. One thing we're doing is we're working with local activists and alternative press and journalists in Philadelphia to try to change the way mainstream newspapers and mainstream journalists cover police and policing and prisons and incarceration in the state of Pennsylvania. And so we're doing something of like an audit where we're looking at the ways that police violence is covered, the way protests against police brutality are covered, and offering sort of alternative frames, also the way prisons and incarceration are covered, that come out of the work of activists and community members and community journalists to offer sort of best practices that might replace some of the problematic ones I talked about a few minutes ago. One of the other organizations we're working with is Free Press, that has done this really great project. I really encourage people to look it up, called Media 2070, that is about reparations for media organizations. It's about holding media organizations accountable to their histories of white supremacy and white supremacist violence. And this includes, the fact that many mainstream media organizations have legitimized lynchings, but even more recently, think about the Central Park jogger or the Exonerated Fives case, right? And the role that the media plays in riling up the public through sort of racist stereotyping in ways that results in really heinous overreaches of the law and the criminal legal system. And so we're in partnership with them on that project. And then we also, I'm not as involved in the other side of it, but we also have quite a bit of projects working with in the gig economy and gig workers, and thinking about what just communication and technologies look like for people who are, for example, Uber drivers or work at Amazon. And my colleague Todd Wolfson works on a lot of that stuff. But those are just kind of some of the community, projects and interventions that we're working on at Mike.
Wow, that sounds great. I have a question from Professor Roseanne Adderley that adds on to that. And so she asks, what are your thoughts on the role of the state in just communication? And you mentioned some about, how the changes in the use of Twitter by government actors, but the state can also play other roles such as censorship, regulation, incentivizing certain values and not others. So yeah, where is the state here?
Yeah. I mean, look, from a social movements perspective, the state is the establishment. I mean, they're not, I think it's really interesting because we were talking earlier about appropriation. And I think there are two entry points here, and I'm not sure which one Professor Adderley is wanting to hear me talk about, so I'll talk about both of them, which is, of course, there are people who become part of, quote unquote, the state, who are very sympathetic and in fact very much on the side of justice. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, Elizabeth Warren, for example, right? Like all these folks who they have the language of the social movements, right? They know what anti-racism means. They themselves are trying to like work on projects around this and support it, and are using the same sort of platforms. But also there is a concern about the ways in which either it becomes appropriated in those contexts, or it becomes sort of individualized, right? The Martin Luther King phenomenon, where a particular person is seen as the savior of X, right? Because they have the highest profile. But in terms of the state itself as institutions and regulatory institutions, I mean, it's a disaster, which is to say, capitalism is one of the biggest problems here. The FCC and sort of commercial interests are a huge problem. We know that social media platforms and other technologies are right now being used and have been being used for fascist purposes, and if for mis and disinformation. And the hesitancy to regulate, often the platforms themselves are blamed, which they are to blame, right? I mean, the platforms themselves, the companies themselves should be engaging in regulation. But the truth is they're not going to engage in the type of regulation they need to, because they're businesses and they want to make money and they want to have as many users as possible and they want to have as many opportunities for paid ads as possible. And that is where the state ideally would come in and say, we need to protect civil society, right? And we have rules. And actually, my colleague Alyssa Richardson, who is at the Annenberg West Coast, she's at USC Annenberg, wrote a really great op-ed recently about why is it that the FCC regulates swear words on primetime television and our ability to see a nipple on primetime television, and yet we have been, for the last year, replaying a video of a man being suffocated to death with a knee on his neck on primetime television over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And no one has considered at the FCC this to be inappropriate for children, for families, for audiences to view, right? And so I think that there is a way in which the government should be doing more. They should be regulating absolutely these social media platforms. But, you know, I think there's both a sort of ignorance, an unfamiliarity. I mean, you see it whenever Mark Zuckerberg testifies before Congress. There's some people in the Congress who get it, and there are some people who are like, oh, social media, I don't know. They clearly don't know how it works, which makes it very hard to make policy around. But also, you know, they have the same donors that are investors in Facebook, right? And so I think that this is, you know, if the question is, should there be more regulation? In my opinion, yes, there should definitely be more regulation, but you know, I'm not sure. I think we're moving in that direction because of what we know about certain anti-democratic interference, but a lot of the threats are not external ones. They're internal to our nation, and I think there's some interesting questions there. You know, I don't know that I have a lot of faith in the state in doing the just thing, but I think they can definitely be pressured into doing the moral thing. And that's what social movements are there to do, right? That's what sort of like just media projects and media sort of justice projects are trying to do.
So turning our attention back to the university. So let me, I think this might be the last question.
Okay.
So, you know, when we started with, you know, discussing land acknowledgements, as well as the acknowledgement of the implications of, you know, both of our universities in the institution of slavery and in kind of anti-Black forms of violence and dispossession sense, I mean, I think that really foregrounds kind of the fact that, you know, the space in which communication research takes place is, you know, by no means a neutral space. It's a space that's structured by power. We were just talking about, you know, on email, you know, about Penn and their possession of the remains of the children who were killed by the police in the MOVE bombing. So, and then it also kind of it also filters down into the, you know, production of knowledge, what kinds of knowledge gets valued, what kinds of scholars get recognized, and you know, in communicate. So I come from film and media studies, so that's my disciplinary background, and you know, if Society of Cinema and Media Studies has just very recently had the kind of reckoning moment with its own whiteness and with its own Eurocentrism. And from what I'm seeing also, that communication at ICA and NCA have also been having these conversations, perhaps 5 years ahead of SCMS, perhaps even. But then, these older and more established disciplines, like this has been the conversation since the 80s. So I'm wondering if you can comment a bit about this. And in COM, it has the hashtag, communication so white. Say a little bit about kind of how, how counterpublics have been constructed within these disciplines or within communication as a discipline.
Yeah. I mean, I hate that this is the last question because I feel like I could talk about this for another half hour, which we definitely don't have, and I don't want to keep people that late. It's an hour later, or where I am too. So I guess I'll just say a couple brief things. Yes, I mean, right on, right? Our disciplines are founded in sort of the same white supremacist logics that our larger academic institutions are based in. And we know that there are histories of exclusion that, I mean, if you started to list the ways in which they play out, right, from the mentorship of students to the hiring of faculty, to the forms of invisible labor that often women of color faculty are doing, to microaggressions, to macroaggressions, to like burnout, to what kinds of topics are seen as legitimate to be published in certain types of journals, right? There are so many layers of gatekeeping, right? And so this stuff that blew up in communication and also to SCMS around, who's included and who's not included, and who's a distinguished scholar and who's not a distinguished scholar, how is that, and so much of it, of course, is about the reproduction of whiteness, of sort of merit and authority being judged by rules that, just like the public sphere, right, those rules were built around exclusion, right? The reason it's an honor to be in that position or be published in that journal is because there's an understanding that other people aren't. And of course, we know who those other people have been, right? And so, it's like there's so much work to be done here, but I think it's been very interesting over the last few years. As you say, I want to acknowledge and honor the fact that I'm sure in film studies as well, there have always been folks who are pushing the boundaries and who are doing this work. There have always been those folks. And so it's not as if we're doing this from scratch. We have a legacy of scholars often from the margins, often pushing back or pushing on issues of racial justice, gender equity, other things. And I really want to recognize that, because I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for those scholars sort of paving that way. But at the same time, it's not, we still have so much more work to do in that regard. And I was telling folks earlier, one of the things that I think is really important is about mentoring students. I was a first generation college student. Neither of my parents went to college. And, I don't know if you saw that recent, I think it was a Washington Post report. I can't remember what the report was, but a recent study came out that was like, something like 75% of academics have parents who had advanced degrees, right? And even, and you're just like, oh, no wonder I've felt like I didn't fit in this whole time. So things like mentoring, things like diversity. I think one of the things that has been frustrating for me, I don't even know if I'm answering your question, by the way, I'm sort of like rambling because there's so much here, but one of the things that's been frustrating for me is, and I would say that this goes back to my original note about these terms needing to mean something and requiring action, is that people have said, oh, okay, we'll diversify the journal board, or we'll diversify, the people on this committee, or we'll diversify our students. And often what folks are doing to diversify things is actually making people of color do more labor. And so, right? And so they're diversifying their committee by putting their 2 women of color faculty members on more committees, even though they're already doing more mentoring work of students and they're already doing more community work than their colleagues, right? Or they're diversifying the editorial board by adding a couple people of color to the editorial board, but then they send those two people every single submission that has anything to do with race and racism, whether or not it's like in their area or not. And they suddenly have, right? And so I think like one of the growing pains that the field is going through right now is figuring out, right? First off, and of course, this is one of the growing pains of whiteness, is like how to do that work yourself. You can't count on the very few people of color who have somehow, you know, crossed the huge boundaries that have been put ahead of them and are exhausted from doing it, to do the work of fixing the field, right? It's very much something that white scholars need to be proactive about, mentoring, you know, students of color, including undergraduate students and first generation students and low income students, about thinking about their own biases in hiring committees and you know, what kind of work they consider representative of the field. I mean, that's one of the things that always boggles my mind, is like folks don't think certain types of work are representative of the field because it's not the work that they do. Right. And I see Dean Edwards, so I'm guessing that's the cue that I have to stop rambling about this, but I could go on forever.
I'd love to join you for half an hour, because I think all of what you're saying is so important.
Yeah, no, I could go on forever about this question, but I will just say to close, there's been a lot of great writing about it. The Communication So White article that was published in JOC, which was about citational practices, you know, cite work that's on race and racism, incorporate that into your work and current your framework. The piece that I wrote with Paula Chakravarty also about how we train our graduate students, which is to say, you know, this really just terrible thing to me, which is I'm in communication because Stuart Hall, because I read an essay, The Whites of Their Eyes, Racist Ideologies in the Mass Media by Stuart Hall when I was an undergraduate. And I knew Stuart Hall was Black. He's a post-colonial subject, you know, in Britain, but from Jamaica, right? And I was like, oh, I can do this, right? And I am shocked that when we did this audit of what is being taught as the canon in communication and media programs, that Stuart Hall was in there, but only because everyone assigns encoding, decoding, which has nothing to do with race, even though everything else Stuart Hall ever wrote was about race. I mean, not everything, but the vast majority, right? And so they're assigning him, but without actually asking their students to do the work around the engagement of race. And so just things like, you know, really intervening in that kind of canon. You mentioned John Durham Peters earlier, and we saw a great syllabus that had assigned Du Bois, Black Reconstruction of America, alongside John Durham Peters in a communication grad class. And we were like, that's how you do it. It's not that you have to take John Durham Peters out, but think how interesting those two texts are in conversation with each other, right? So anyways, again, could go on forever, but I will stop because I know we're over time.
Sarah, let me just say, first of all, thank you. And that last answer kind of, or that last, you know, thinking together about Thorne's great question shows to me and reminds us how important this series is and what we're trying to, in your talk, and really what so many of us are trying to think about is how to bring together the intellectual and the academic critique of the field with actual, you know, practices in the, whether it's in journals or in tenure review processes or in, you know, committee assignments. So I really appreciate that. And I do know that there are a lot of people who are, whether they're in administrative roles or I hope in editorial roles, you know, trying to think through this with us. So your advice is, and your continued advice is really important and deeply appreciated. That said, I mean, you know, no, so thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
You know, we are, as I said, actually, I don't know because if it was on at the beginning or if it was when we were, before we started, but we are, you know, at the end of the first semester of this series. We haven't fully announced the fall schedule, but we're almost finished putting it together. We will be moving in person. Those who I've secured for the fall are planning to come to New Orleans. And then, as I mentioned, Sarah, we've already scheduled someone for the spring of 2022, and when I think we'll wrap up the series, and we hope to do so with some sort of larger event. We hope to see you then in New Orleans. So thank you not only for a really inspiring and edifying talk. I'm sorry for like such generic words, but there's so much. So, and then the conversation was like a whole other feast. Thank you, Thorne, for really.
Yes, thank you, Thorne. Great questions. Thank you.
Thanks for your answers. They're so great, and you know, so
and we know it's late in the semester, so we know many people will be coming back in and looking at the recording. So I'll kind of wrap it up. It will be on the website as soon as we can get it up there. But Sarah, thank you for your work.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thorne, thanks too.
Everyone, thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, I know we don't have it's not like a TV.
You can't see them, but we're glad you're here.
We're glad you're here. Now let's all repair to the cocktail party on the other side of the room.
We wish.
Not tonight, but the next time.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. And thanks again, Sarah. Have a good evening and a good weekend for everybody coming up.